Everybody, my name is Paul Salem. I am the Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Programs here at the Middle East Institute. Very pleased to welcome you today to this panel discussion examining the recent protests in Morocco and Tunisia. On the 7-year anniversary of the outbreak of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, protesters took to the streets again. Economic stagnation, slow political reform have resulted in widespread frustration there. Tunisians feel they have not reaped the benefits of the Arab Spring despite several transitions of power. Over 1,000 people were arrested, although the government has since pledged improvements to social welfare programs. In nearby Morocco, the deaths of 2 young mine workers in the small town of Jerada also sparked large demonstrations. Protesters complain about high unemployment and poor governance. The Moroccan government itself pledged to launch a new development initiative to address these grievances. What are the primary drivers behind these recent protests? How do the crowds differ in makeup or priorities from the 2011 protests? What new social and political issues and conversations are being triggered? What are the prospects to lower unemployment and combat the issues of corruption that the protesters are fighting for? Here to discuss these issues, we have a very excellent panel of diverse perspectives. To my immediate right is my friend and former colleague Intissar Fakir. Intissar is the editor-in-chief of Sada at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to joining Carnegie, she was special assistant to the vice president for strategy and policy at the National Endowment for Democracy. She's worked on implementing democracy and education assistance programs throughout the Middle East, and she is originally Moroccan. Wafa bin Hassin, the MENA Policy Council for Access Now, was supposed to join us from Tunisia, but ironically, as Tunisians are finding their voice, Wafa just lost her voice to the flu, so she was unable to join us. But lucky for us, Mr. Aymen Abderahmen, a Tunisian journalist, the first secretary of the Tunisian watchdog organization iWatch, and the former secretary of Youth Can, will be joining us by Skype, and I hope you see him there on the screen. We are also pleased to have Freedom House's Dokhi Fassihian. Dokhi is Senior Program Manager for Middle East and North Africa. Before joining Freedom House, she led several non-government organizations working in the area of democracy, human rights, and human rights promotion. And here to share with us his views and a perspective on the U.S. response to these demonstrations or to U.S. policy in these countries in general, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Bill Lawrence. Bill is a visiting professor of political science and international affairs at GW's Elliott School. He's a fellow at the Tangiers American Legation Institute for Moroccan Studies, a board member and past president of the American Tunisian Association, and a number of other very interesting positions. Bill, thanks for being with us. We are recording today's event and posting it on the MEI website, so please silence your cell phones, but we do encourage tweeting using the hashtag MEI event. Thank you again for coming, and let's get right to it. And Intissar, let me start with you, with the situation in Morocco. Give us a context of the social and economic context for these protests, how they differ maybe with events in 2011 and 2012, and how the government has been dealing with them.
Sure, thanks, Paul, and thanks to MEI for having me. What we're seeing in Morocco is an important outcome of the 2011 protests. This is essentially Moroccans' willingness to engage and speak out on issues of importance and impact. Despite what they see around the region in terms of instability, civil war, and also despite the threat of government crackdown, people are still willing to go out and protest. And this has essentially meant an increase in scope and intensity of protests around Morocco. And these all are about similar themes. So you have socio-economic issues, but you also have political issues. And one of the interesting things about these protests is that they're taking place at this sort of peripheral provincial level. So outside of Rabat and Casablanca, as we have seen, with the reef protests that started in October of 2016 after the terrible crushing of a young fish vendor in a garbage disposal, and also what we see in Jerada, that started in December following, as Paul mentioned, the death of 2 minors. So, for instance, before I talk about Jerada, I want to just kind of go back and mention one thing about the Reef protests. Of course, the Reef has a contentious place in Moroccan history. This was the site of a terrible crackdown from the previous king that has essentially led to neglect and marginalization of the region. And of course, that's not the only region that's marginalized in Morocco. Jerada also, which is in the eastern province. This is a coal mining town that in the 90s, the government has essentially either shut down or sold off the mines, and there's been little alternative employment for these young people. And these young people are also hit disproportionately with sort of unemployment. The national average for unemployment in Morocco is 10%. For youth, the government has recently said it's around 30%. So that's a big difference. Two things about the protests, as I mentioned earlier, they're really about socio-economic issues: unemployment, uneven development across the regions in Morocco, but they're also about really fundamentally political issues like poor governance and the lack of accountability. Who do you hold responsible when nothing works in your region? The authorities' response to these has sort of varied. We saw significant crackdown that I think maybe we'll hear about a little bit, arrests. Some almost 400 people, including journalists, were arrested in the Reef. And of course, there were promises to provide some immediate relief for some of these hard-hit areas in the form of employment, improved access to basic services like healthcare, education, and so forth. But also an interesting thing that sort of emerged is, I don't know if you follow Moroccan politics closely, but it was the promise by the king to investigate some of this poor governance and really look into administrative incompetence. And what he has done is that he launched this investigation, and then he's essentially sacked a bunch of ministers and local officials. Now, what this does is it really sort of reveals some fundamental issues about the exercise of power in Morocco, where you have a government that has a limited mandate, really not a lot of room to govern, and you have a palace that's very powerful, but presumably really doesn't occupy itself with everyday governance issues. So who do people hold accountable in that case? We can go more into the details of this, but I thought I'd stop
Yeah,
here.
thank you, Intissar. Let me ask you, if you'd put it in the longer trajectory of Morocco's interesting, it's not a transition exactly, but the way the king dealt with the events of 2011, getting ahead of things and trying to absorb the fact that Morocco allowed the Islamist party, the PJD, for a good while to lead the government. If you just try to situate it in the broader political trajectory of how the king or the authorities are handling political evolution or change in Morocco, and if you'd also situate it in separately in a bit the economic development story. Tunisia has its own issues, it's had its own challenges. How does this fit? You mentioned the mines and so on, and the uneven development, but also how would you situate it in the longer term economic attempt, since most of these things, as you said, are about unemployment and income and things of that nature?
So in terms of Morocco's sort of gradual reform process, one of the things that I would really point at is this very interesting dynamic between palace and government. So the government is very much secondary to the palace in the way that the country is managed. But in 2011, a quick response to the protests that took place in the country, the king promised constitutional reforms, and really some of the main things in the constitutional reforms was to essentially give a bigger mandate to elected institutions, that's parliament and government. What happened, the Islamists came to power, and I will just quickly say about the Islamists is that obviously the palace controls, maybe not obviously, but the palace controls all of the political actors pretty closely in Morocco, the Islamists included, although the Islamists have managed to maintain a little bit more independence from the palace than other political actors, and therefore a little bit more credibility as sort of not co-opted. And so what happened is that the Islamists came to power, and one of the main tensions that followed between them and the palace is this process of trying to negotiate the extent to which the constitutional empowerment of parliament and government would be implemented. And now, recently, we've seen a little bit of not a little bit, but a backtracking of that, where the government intervened very heavily in government formation negotiations, really didn't allow the Islamists to have the coalition that they wanted. So we ended up with another weak government. Now there is, I think, 6 or 7 parties in a coalition, so it's diffused. They're not really able to do a whole lot. So this is a sort of a retraction of what we saw immediately after 2011. This is also happening in the context of bigger mobilization, bigger engagement in politics, or at least sort of more willingness to mobilize.
But if I may, to interject, how do these protests do or do not fit into the broader political scheme? Is somebody taking advantage of them on the political stage? Are they just local protests? How do you read them?
I think the main difference between these protests and what we saw in 2011 is that they're really very much kept at the regional level. They haven't really spread a lot. We saw very few instances in which there were sort of solidarity protests in Rabat and in Casablanca. And I think until they reach that level of becoming more of a national movement, we're not going to see a lot of response on the part of the government and the palace. Having said that, both government and palace really sort of tried to respond to what was going on in the Rif because it had lasted for so long, and sort of tried to sort of respond without. For the government, this really was an issue because it was happening at a pretty critical time. This was right after the election. The government formation was right in the middle. The palace, didn't really do anything, didn't even acknowledge the protests for a long time, and then eventually sort of launched this investigation and started firing people. The government just doesn't have the credibility to intervene. They tried to go out, send delegations to negotiate with people on the ground, and people said, "We know you're not really, you're not really able to do anything." But to me, really, the big issue is that this reinforces this sort of lopsided dynamic between the palace and the government. The government doesn't have enough of a mandate to act. The palace just doesn't really get too involved in these issues. So what happens is that people have to go and sort of personally appeal to the king, which reinforces which reinforces the sort of bad dynamic that politicians aren't really effective. One of the interesting things of this relationship is that elected officials have a role to play, right? So they have to be effective, but they can't be too effective as to overshadow the palace. But then what you don't want is the monarchy to sort of swing the other way and make them seem completely irrelevant, so that they expose themselves. And
a few words on the broader economic context.
On the broader economic context, the one thing that I would highlight is these efforts at decentralization that the government has been talking about and has been trying to implement, and it really is down to again, really poor management, poor administrative processes. There's a lot of seemingly good programs in the works, like this Husayma Manarat al-Mutawassit, which is a huge project. It's something like $700 million budget, but again, it's been bogged down. So you see a lot of really good initiatives on the ground, the economy on the whole. There are some significant efforts to try and restructure it and improve it. But really, the benefits aren't really getting down to the people just yet.
Thank you, Intissar, very much. Our panelist, Aymen Abderahmen from Tunisia, for technical reasons, cannot hear us, but we're in communication with him, and he's going to make his remarks about the Tunisian protests and how he sees them. But unfortunately, we will not be able to engage him in a Q&A. So we'll wait for him to get that message and hope that works before proceeding with our panelists here. Bear with us for a moment. I'm told the Tunisian internet is
not very good.
Several reasons are leading to the current instability in Tunisia. Thank you, first of all, for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk, actually in my intervention, I'm going to talk mainly about 3-4 points that are leading the current situation to continue into instability. The first one, which is the main point that led Tunisians and Tunisian youth in specific to take out to the street and protest again, as they have done and still doing since December 2010. The economic situation isn't balanced. The bad governance, the lack of transparency, especially when it comes to the government. The government's declared war on corruption that was declared about 7 months ago, and we still, Tunisians, don't have any declared results from the government or any national agencies about the results of these huge numbers of arrests of businessmen, of state public servants, and else, who are now being sued in front of military courts, which is another violation of human rights, which is another negative sign that the current government and the current regime in Tunisia is sending to the Tunisian youth and to the international community as well. The second point I would like to discuss is that during the recent unrest and during the recent protests, about over 1,000 individuals, I'm not saying protester or activist, but over 1,000 individuals has been arrested, and this started to happen even days before the protests, even days before the campaigns against the austerity measures and the new budget that was declared by the government. These arrests started to happen randomly and sometimes specifically targeting activists that we know, targeting students of the university or students. Usually human social campaign on every social movement in the country. So this, on the other hand, as well, contributed to the sentiment of frustration, the sentiment of, or actually even the feeling of lack of trust towards the government among youth and university students mostly. The third point I would like to mention is the unwillingness of Tunisians and mostly Tunisian youth to wait and to hold on and to just wait for the government to make reforms or to change things or to give them better options and choices. We have been hearing a lot from the different governments that took the power after the revolution, but none of them gave enough confidence or sent enough positive messages to the public and mostly to the Tunisian youth so that they could actually bear with them and support this transition. On the contrary, currently, for instance, we are working on the reform of the asset declaration law, which was first adopted in Tunisia in 1987. But since then, we haven't had any public declaration of assets by a public servant, by a Tunisian minister or Tunisian president. We don't know anything about what public officials, about what members of the parliament have or have after they finish their mandates. Actually, which is even funny, the exact parliamentary committee that is working on this law, on the reform of the asset declaration law and fighting conflict of interest, has among its members just one who declared her declares her assets, and this committee has 20 members in it. Last point I'd like to mention is that currently the press, freedom of press, is met with lots of hostility from the police side, from the government side. Even the president is more or less discussing or criticizing very negatively the performance or the work of the Tunisian media, and even most surprisingly, is now criticizing more and more every reporter of foreign media, every activist who is speaking to foreign media, in a way to make a division within among journalists and among every servant in the media scene or the journalist scene. So tomorrow, the National Union of Tunisian Journalists, SNJT, will be observing a protest tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Tunisia time, to protest against these measures that are taken by the Ministry of Interior of arresting randomly Tunisian journalists and just not allowing them to do their work in favorable conditions. So all these points combined, they are pushing Tunisian youth, they are pushing Tunisian citizens not to have less and less trust in the current administration and to have more reasons to go out and protest again.
Well, thank you, Aymen. I don't know if he can hear us. Apparently not, but we thank him for that intervention and the points he made. Let me turn, Dokhi, to you. You might have also things to add to what Aymen said on Tunisia. But I wanted to ask you maybe, from your perch at Freedom House, looking at these two examples. On the one hand, these are healthy signs of people not being afraid, protesting as an expression of their rights and so on. You have different legal contexts in which NGOs can or cannot operate, and you have different political reactions in terms of either engaging and opening up or repressing of the two governments or palace/government and so on. How would you describe and compare the two?
Well, the context is obviously very different. Tunisia is a more open society. We rate it as a free country, even though we've noted significant declines in 2017, given the failure of the government to institute very, very important reforms. But it still respects fundamental freedoms more than the Moroccan government does. And these protests are not just, we're seeing them in Morocco, we're seeing them in Tunisia, we're also seeing them as eastward as Iran. And this is not the subject of this panel, but it's shockingly similar, the reasons why these protests are taking place across the Middle East. It's about economic dignity. It's about the poor getting poorer. It's about very similar issues of rising employment unemployment among the youth, inflation, corruption, the inability to influence policies, to improve marginalized communities. All of these protests in all of these three countries, not just Morocco and Tunisia, but even in Iran, are taking place in sort of areas of the country that are outside the capital. And even in Tunis, it's happening really in the poorer parts of Tunis, primarily because they really are economically driven. And they're happening in contexts, very different legal contexts, like I stated. And in what we're seeing, I see some hope here, because I think that all of the governments, and Morocco and Tunisia specifically, they are attempting at least to try to respect freedom of assembly, and to some degree freedom of association. Of course, Morocco has these red lines that you can't cross. And those that have been detained in Morocco have suffered seemingly more abuses than those in Tunisia. But there have been abuses and detention in Tunisia as well. One positive thing that we've seen in Tunisia is that some of the people that have been arrested in Tunisia, some of the activists, have been released, and the judges have released them and acquitted them. And that's because there's a new law that was adopted in Tunisia last year that assures people who are detained to have access to an attorney. And of course, not all the security forces are respecting that, but a lot of the activists that have been detained and protesters have asked for that attorney, and a lot of times they didn't get the attorney. And so this is obviously still something evolving in Tunisia, but it's a hopeful sign that the lawyers that are representing these detainees in front of these judges are saying that their rights weren't upheld, and in some cases they've been acquitted. So that's, I think, very positive. In Morocco, things, the government tried to, I think the first few months, tolerate the protests and then ban the protests and then crack down severely and really seize additional protests as a threat. They've arrested the leader of the Hirak movement. He's still in pretrial detention. And there are accusations of torture that the prosecutor refuses to actually to investigate. And the judiciary is not independent of the executive yet. There have been some steps late last year for the Moroccan government to separate the prosecutor from the executive, from the king, from the purview of the king in the executive branch. And that now is supposed to be moving into the judiciary, but a lot more needs to be done. And the judiciary is certainly not operating independently of the security forces. And the Moroccan, the king said, that in his speech last year when he came out and spoke about these protests, he really supported the security forces. And even though there were these abuses that were taking place and this severe crackdown. So Morocco's definitely not, I think initially it tried to show that it was going in the right direction, but it's not going in the right direction. And so we are seeing a decline both in Tunisia and in Morocco, of these rights. But nonetheless, I think the fact that people are protesting and they feel empowered to protest, I think is a good sign.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask two questions, again, comparative to both. Interestingly, I think you both have said, and Aymen as well, that these are less in the capital, more in the provinces, and Iran as well. Mm. And that's an interesting phenomenon, that maybe that first realization of rights and freedoms happened centrally, and now it's sort of reached there. And my question is, you've all brought up the challenges of governance and who can do what, accountability, whether in Morocco or in Tunisia. And I want to, pose the question of local governance or regional governance. Has there been progress there? Is there any decision making at that level that protesters can deal with, rather than somebody, in a province appeals to the king or appeals to the capital of Tunisia?
That's an excellent question. And I think all these governments have taken steps to decentralize. Whether they're really devolving authority is another question. I think it's really, really slow. And it's uneven. And for example, in Tunisia's case, they keep postponing elections. They've postponed it for the 5th time, I think. And now we're supposed to have the municipal council elections in May. The hope is that when these local councils are set up, that they have the authority to, both from a budgetary and a financial perspective and from a management perspective, to actually govern their areas and their territories. I think it's going to be slow, and I think it's definitely not something that the central government feels comfortable with. I don't think they're going to immediately give up their power. I think they're finding every kind of way to create mechanisms by which, the local councils have to get approval for certain things, or they have oversight. So we have that, and we have that across the region. I think Morocco is a leader on decentralization in the region generally, but I still think there is some control by the central authorities. So I don't think that we're there yet, basically.
Intissar, any comment on that?
Sure. Yeah. I would just add that, as you just mentioned, there was also a lot of confusion about how decentralization in a place like Morocco would take place. So in 2015 was the first election of the local councils. But the issue is that there are authorities that sort of govern at the local level that are appointed by the king. So now you have an elected council and you have an authority that's appointed by the king. And it's not clear how these two work. It's not clear how budgetary responsibilities will be sort of handed down. But I would just caution, I think for Morocco and also for Tunisia, I'm not sure that decentralization is going to be really sort of the panacea that it's made out to be. These issues will remain, whether they're at the local level or at the national level. You need more transparency, and you really need more accountability. Elected officials need to be held accountable and need to sort of, they need to respond to the people who elect them, not to a different sort of authority, whether it's the king or someone else.
Okay, thank you, Intissar. Bill, let's turn to you. U.S. policy towards Tunisia and Morocco,
Context,
how does it fit into the broader context? And what are your views about what's going on as well? You follow North Africa and always have.
So thank you, Paul and Kate and Wendy and the other organizers of the event. And I'm always happy when MEI shines a spotlight on North Africa, which is not done enough in Washington, as so much of U.S. policymaking regarding MENA is focused on me and not Na. So when we turn over to the Couscous zone or the Amazigh zone, I'm very, very happy. I think when we look at the U.S. Foreign policy towards both MENA and North Africa, I think the first point to make is there's a number of views and engagement at the level of foreign policy experts and the various institutions and quasi-governmental like USIP and IRI and NED and all that, and then the non-governmental organizations in Washington. So there's this huge variegated conversation with North Africa that some of it operates independent of what the administration is doing, and then within the administration you have a number of factions and debates going on, which I'll get into a little bit. But if I was going to characterize this administration's sort of position on engagements with MENA in general, they're looking for a combination of spectacular wins, right, combined with a perception of rollback and a decrease of engagement and expenditures while not being seen to upset any apple carts, right? And because of this sort of three competing aspects of this, it's ended up in what I've been calling in some of my writing the Goldilocks principle. That we're sort of they'll taste hot and then they'll taste cold and then they'll end up somewhere close to where the Obama administration was or the previous administrations through this process of trial and error. There's a reason why the U.S. government does certain things in certain parts of the world and is able to do them, and a lot of these other things have been tried, but some of them are being tried now and then they fail. And now the first big engagement regarding North Africa with the Trump administration I won't dwell on, but it was that you may remember the incident with the Italian prime minister who came and asked for help on Libya. And basically the answer from Trump himself was, we're not interested in Libya. And then we, very interestingly, in the subsequent 2 days, the State Department and the White House put out correcting restatements of U.S. engagement with North Africa, which was very interesting. And I don't remember in the past the way a government has to sort of scramble to reassert the middle, right? To reassert the existing policy. Now, despite the long history of friendship treaties that we always hear about with North Africa and all this, the main engagements of the U.S. government are with North Africa. Now, Joan Polaczyk gave at a think tank this fall, I think, the best statement I've heard of the Trump administration's MENA policy, and there were sort of I counted 17 principles. 17, yes. 3 of which involved North Africa. One was seeking a peace deal for Libya, assisting with Tunisia's democratic transition, and fighting ISIS regionally. All the others had to do with the Middle East, the larger ISIS struggle, confronting Iran, stabilizing Iraq, helping with the horrible Syria and Yemen conflicts and all the refugee crisis and all that, and then solving the GCC conflict. And we're having a strategic dialogue in Washington right now about GCC conflict, which is right now a bigger deal, right, to the State Department and to the U.S. government than what's going on in North Africa. It was interesting, though, if you looked at what Trump said in the State of the Union address earlier this week. He name-checked Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Israel via Jerusalem without mentioning North Africa. But he did say, that is why tonight I'm asking Congress to pass legislation to help ensure American foreign assistance dollars always serve American interests and only go to American friends. And this I would connect to the sort of 2 levels of transactionalism we're getting from this administration. One is on the level of transactions with friends, and sort of identifying in the moment and over time who our friends are vis-a-vis whatever the big issue is, Iran, ISIS, right? Who are our friends, and then transacting with them. And then the other level of transactionalism is actual transactions. So one of the reasons the U.S. is spending so much time focused on the Middle East rather than North Africa is that's where the money is. There isn't a lot of financial advantage to
Benefit,
engaging
yeah.
with North Africa. But that's, I think, the best way to see it. Now, the next big North Africa moment for this administration was on the rollout of the May budget, but that didn't really become an issue until July, and where there was a slash by roughly half of the Tunisian assistance. And again, in this case, it was internally within the executive branch, but then also very quickly McCain and others in Congress, certainly Lindsey Graham and some others, stepped up and said, no, Tunisia is important to us. And although Joan couldn't say when and how much of the Tunisia assistance will be, I've had internal meetings with the staffers that handle on appropriations, and they say Tunisia is going to get all its money back. That's a congressional action against the budget of the administration. I also learned from those meetings that there's a certain earmarking going on, a good kind of earmarking within the Tunisian assistance, where it's going to be more focused on democracy promotion and the institutions of democracy, and on economic governance issues, which are connected to these protests. So there's some awareness, often the information coming in through think tanks and other lobbyists and other kinds, there's some awareness in Congress of the necessity of Congress to step up and actually, earmark where the funds are going. By way of criticism, this piecemeal, haphazard approach to North African security politics economics is mistaken. Obviously, the U.S. needs a more strategic view, like the one we're doing with Qatar right now. And while working hard on Libya has big positive externalities for Tunisia, and you can't solve Tunisia's security issues without solving Libya as well. And so I often argue how connected those countries are more than we realize, and the border issues are huge. And the economic issues in the south, which are connected to the protests in the south, which weren't as big in the last wave, but will come back again, that continues to be very important. In terms of the protests, and I'm just about done, let me just make a couple quick points. First of all, I don't situate the Moroccan protests as starting in 2011. I see them really starting in the 90s. And there's sort of a straight line in the way Moroccans protest about what they protest with the gradual democratic opening fits and starts. And the modalities of protest of 2011, some of it was internationally inspired, but a lot of it was just the way Moroccans protest, about which they protest. Interestingly, though, all three Maghreb core countries, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, are having big measurable increases in micro-protests. Algeria is over 11,000 micro-protests a year. Morocco is over 10,000. Tunisia is over 8,000. And while we can beneficially find certain coherence, and I had nice lists from Intissar and Dokhi about coherent threads, and from our speaker from Tunisia, coherent threads, a lot of this micro-protest isn't necessarily connected to themes, but it's about exam results, access to jobs in a mine, a lot of hyper local issues. And then, as Intissar correctly pointed out, when these spike into regional waves and national waves is the $64,000 question. And that's often hard to predict, but also has to do with who's making the protests, how they're articulated, what other nearby grievances. And I'd also just make another point that comes from my own research, which is that Tunisian modalities of protest are very much rooted in Algerian protests going back to 1988, whether it's self-immolation, whether slogans, there's lots of Algerianness in the Tunisian protests, and there's a reason why in 2010 and early 11 they quickly spread to the areas near Algeria, and I'm saying more of that and work I'm working now. And also Algerian protests and Moroccan protests connect to European protests, modalities of protest, slogans, and all this. So there's and all the way over to Iran, as Dokhi quickly pointed out. So there are lots of locality, subnational local issues, national level, but also international cross-pollination of protests, which are necessary to understand to get the full story. But getting back to your question to Intissar, this is a Daniel Bromberg question, the micro-protests are evidence, right, of a breakdown of politics. And what all the democratic and non-democratic institutions and governments are doing in North Africa is rewarding non-politics, right? So they're basically saying to the street, they all do it, right? If you want to go through your normal political parties and through the parliament, you're not going to get much. But if you go out in the street, we'll start trying to make concessions to you. And so there's a feedback loops to street protests and micro protests, which are positive. And then further, in sort of a vicious circle sort of way, further the degradation of politics as usual, parliamentary politics, party politics, and further ingrain in the popular mind the uselessness, right? And this is why voting rates in all the North African countries are extremely low because of this feedback loop. Let me conclude by saying the U.S. continues to suffer from, and this administration continues from, a sort of a security-first approach. And I was shocked how many of the think tanks, in their advice to the Trump administration over the last year, were taking the security-first approach. When we've learned that security-first approach not only insufficiently address all the issues that lead to insecurity, but actually make the situation worse. And so, in the area of recommendations, the more what I call, in the Tunisian case, revolutionary dividends you can target at youth, and Macron has started to talk about this, but not sufficiently with his visit. And the more in Morocco, you can address a very similar set of issues related to unemployed university graduates and regional issues and all this. The more we'll begin to see appreciation among young protesters that the government is actually hearing them. But we're not there yet in any of the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. Let me ask a few questions of the panel, then we'll turn over to the audience for their questions. Intissar, you run Sada, a wonderful platform for a lot of voices from the region, a lot of them of the younger generation. And these protests largely are of that generation. What would you describe as, we've talked about governance and foreign policy and economics and so on. What are the narratives that are coming out from the younger people in Tunisia and Morocco? How would you group them into themes or things that would be fresh to what we were talking about?
It's very much what we've talked about, really this sort of, on the one hand, frustration with socioeconomic issues, but also this sort of loss of a sense of agency and really not feeling like they have, access to decision-making, like Dokhi said earlier. I would say really these are the two main things
that are dominant. Dokhi, would you add anything to that in terms of voices you're hearing?
I think that's right. I think, young people are getting educated, and they want good jobs, and they want a good life, and, they want to stay in their country and do that, and they don't want to go to Europe, and some of them, right? And so, and they're not seeing that opportunity for themselves, and I think that's incredibly frustrating. I think the corruption issue is incredibly frustrating, and it goes back to what Intissar was saying about transparency and accountability. Both Morocco and Tunisia are characterized as moderately to highly corrupt countries. Tunisia is a little bit less corrupt, but they're very close in terms of their rating by Transparency International. And I think this is an issue that really exacerbates the mentality of the youth that if my family's not connected, to someone in the palace, and I'm not going to get this job no matter what degree I get, if I'm not from this group or in this circle or from this ethnic background, then I'm not going to be able to succeed. And they just don't see a way, forward for themselves, and it's just getting worse for them. And I think that's part of the frustration.
Well, let me ask on the issue of rights. We've talked a lot about sort of the political aspect and corruption and so on. But both countries have made some strides on social rights, issues for women, legislation, inheritance, things of that nature. I think Tunisia just opened the first LGBT radio station or something like that. There's progress there. Could you comment, both of you or all three of you, on the social human rights thing that's also going on, progress or lack of progress?
Yeah. Well, human rights is very broad, but we can talk a little bit about women's rights and the rights of LGBTQ. Tunisia is making good progress on these issues. There's more to be done, of course. Tunisia has NGOs that work openly on this issue. They're becoming more and more engaged with other civil society, which is the first step. and they're getting to make more allies in government. So their voice is being heard. Of course, abuses still happen against them, but they're at least speaking out about them and being heard. On the women's rights front, Tunisia has made some significant progress. They passed a good domestic violence law. It's not perfect, but it's good, and improvements can be made in the future. But it's a good step in the right direction. The president made a statement, I think it was in September, calling for equal rights for women on inheritance. This is a very big deal in the Muslim world, and even Ennahda, the Islamist party, opposition party, we can't call it an opposition party anymore, but the coalition, the other party governing in the coalition with Nida Tunis, didn't come out against it necessarily. I mean, there were some people were expressing opposition, but in general, there seems to be very high level support for that from the president. One just issue that I want to raise, a flag there, is that this really goes back to sort of state-driven, particularly this issue on inheritance. I have some concerns with it because I think it took up sort of all the headlines 2 or 3 months ago internationally, and it kind of President Sepsi tries to show himself as this modernist, secular president that sees Tunisia as a very modern, secular country. But sort of quietly behind that, he was pushing the economic reconciliation bill, which was this amnesty bill that was hugely unpopular and provides for impunity, really, for those that were charged with crimes, and particularly financial crimes under the Ben Ali regime. So progress is being made, but it's also being used, and a lot of sort of smoke and mirrors is happening at the same time. I think the key point is to continue the progress from the grassroots, and to make sure we're working at the grassroots, and that gender equality activists working at the grassroots are being heard and they're allowed to operate. I think that's really important. On Morocco, I think there's a lot of activism in Morocco, and sorry, you can speak better to this than I can, but a lot more needs to be done. I don't think they've passed their domestic violence bill yet. They've been working on it very hard. They're working on a variety of other issues, including inheritance rights. I think there's still a lot to be done for LGBTQ as well.
Could you, Intissar, comment?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I like you mentioned, there's a lot of civil society activism, and in terms of specifically women's rights, in 2004, Morocco passed the new personal status law, which had some very significant implications for women, divorce, polygamy, and so on. But ultimately, I would make the same point that you made as well, in that these sort of become a little bit of sidetracking issues, kind of distractions, really, when there should be more focus and a bigger conversation about some more of the substantial issues. In terms of civil society, I would say right after 2000, I mean, Morocco has always had a pretty vibrant civil society. But after 2011, we saw, as sort of, the steam was kind of taken out of the 2011 protests that were happening in Morocco with the passage of the new constitution, we really saw a lot more engagement in sort of more social issues where civil society is concerned. So you saw a lot of people going out and, sort of working with arts and really trying to sort of do a little more service provision at the local level and that kind of thing. So that's sort of been an interesting direction in which civil society has gone. But yeah, I would just go back to the issue of kind of these being used a little bit to sort of say, look, we're very progressive, we're very sort of forward-looking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Intissar. Bill, your comments, and I want to add a question to you. My question to you is, I mean, Europe is the major player in North Africa, not the U.S. You mentioned President Macron in passing. Tell us a bit about your view about your current European policy, particularly towards these two countries, after hearing your comments on the latest issue.
A lot to say, but I'll make it quick. I think the first point I'd like to make is there was an Arab Spring. Somebody talks about uprisings now. There weren't uprisings in North Africa. There was an Arab Spring, which failed in many ways, succeeded in others, like the Prague Spring, the Berber Spring, the pick your spring, Springtime of the Peoples. I've done a whole talk on spring, right? There was an Arab Spring. There was a Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, which is unfinished. But one of the characteristics of the Jasmine Revolution is that the revolutionaries didn't take over. The three main organized protagonists of the Jasmine Revolution were the UGTT, which played a big role in the 2013 political deal, but
Which
is
is
not
the
in
Labor
power.
Federation.
Yeah, the Labor Federation, but they're not in power. The Bar Association, many of which leaders, the Bar Associations, many of whose leaders are in the opposition in Parliament right now, and the unemployed university graduates, who most of whom haven't gone into government. So we had a revolution where the revolutionaries didn't take over. Right, and so, and we're often wondering when we're looking at the Tunisian parliament in Tunisian, they're acting like a mature democracy when the population wants a revolution. It's a revolutionary democracy, and I that's why I use the word revolutionary dividends. I don't think this parliament. And I meet with parliamentarians every time I go to Tunisia. I don't think the urgency. And this is going to connect to Morocco point I'm going to the urgency of a post-revolutionary moment and post-revolutionary expectations. And then I often hear think tankers around town saying, well, the Tunisian youth are too impatient. No, we're 7 years out, right? Still nothing, right? That's not too long. World Bank used to talk about a 5-year post-revolutionary J-curve, right? We're in the 7th year and Tunisia economy is much worse off, right? So, and that connects to Morocco. Morocco didn't have a revolution. It had an Arab Spring and it got a new constitution, but there's this huge disconnect between the promises of the constitution, the organic laws, which is the second layer of laws, most of which haven't been implemented, or those of which have been implemented have been disappointing to some degree, right? And the actual statute level laws, which are in huge contradiction with both the constitution and the practice of the Moroccan government. If you look at what caused the recent protests, it's the authorities acting in ways that aren't consistent with the constitution, right? So we have a different kind of disconnect in Morocco where the promise of change has not been fulfilled either. And then Europe's been even more disappointing, I would say. Isn't it interesting that France, Tunisia's leading trade partner, isn't the leading investor? The leading investor in Tunisia is UAE, right? What's on that? Why is it on so many projects that the French could be doing in Morocco, the Germans are doing smaller, better stuff? India is doing great things in Tunisia. But France and the EU in general never scaled to the task of dealing with Tunisia and focused too much on things like migration and borders, which is, plays to the domestic French audience, but doesn't deal with the underlying issues. And then beyond that, Macron hasn't even really gotten the notes right, the symbolic things. So at a minimum, Macron could, and I said this on France 24 yesterday, right? At a minimum, Macron could be making big pronouncements about encouraging investment, right? Bringing in all kinds of new kinds of investment. But no, we're getting kind of a lukewarm, tepid, a little bit like in fact, better than, but similar in the problems of the U.S. idea of like, we want big successes, but we want to spend less money and do less. So, you won't be able to solve Tunisia's fundamental problems. Let me add another thing. The Barcelona context, European Neighborhood Policy 5+5, all that has conditionality. And for years, right, Europe never applied the legal conditionality provisions for human rights, for democracy. Right. So that was another lever Europe never used. So I see France continuing to get Tunisia wrong when France should be playing a much bigger role than even the U.S. And this adds to the cacophony of Tunisians coming to Washington saying, America, you need to do more. Part of that's just because France hasn't stepped up.
Can I just add a couple of things on EU policy in North Africa? I think, Bill, what you're saying sort of implies that there's been a change to European priorities in North Africa.
I hope I didn't make that impression.
They really haven't. I mean, the European priorities in North Africa, which is migration and stability, have been the same. And they've gotten even worse with Libya. So I think the approach is not likely to be changed. I mean, there is I look at, for example, EU relations with Morocco. There is significant reluctance to push Morocco on reform. You talk about revolution and promise of reform. These are very, very subtle promises that we're talking about here. We're not talking about some fundamental change. And even on those, Europe is very reluctant to push. So I think it's good to be a little realistic about what to expect from Europe and what is likely to be gotten. And just a quick question that comment that you had mentioned the UGTT and the youth. Maybe you can speak to this. The UGTT did play a very important role in 2013, and they continued to through sort of, exerting pressure on the government to do some significant essentially passed laws that would ultimately not be very beneficial for the economy. So I'm sort of, there was a part of maybe the revolutionary that sort of came to power, or maybe had a way into manipulating power.
But let me can I ask you to make a quick thing?
Quick, because I want to turn to the audience.
One of the and the France 24 interview, one of the questions they asked me was, will the moves they made after the austerity, placate the protesters? And I said they won't placate the protesters at all, but they may placate the opposition a little bit, because right now Tunisia in many ways is being governed by the 2016 Carthage Pact, which basically brought the opposition and the ruling parties together based on the 2013 negotiations, the Nobel Prize winning, consensus, right? And so now opposition's been sort of quasi bought off, right? And these little, aid to the poor and some of the other little things that the Tunisian government announced, I felt was not really to placate the crowd; it was to placate the opposition and the UGTT. So that was my point. And I think we're agreeing, even though if I didn't say it correctly, is that the UGTT led the revolution in many ways, and they're marginally influencing policy. Mm-hmm. The Bar Association's marginally influencing policy, and the unemployed graduates are in the street if they're anywhere. At Feshtenstein now, they're part of the movement. So you don't have a revolutionary ethos, set of policies, or vision governing Tunisia when that's what the population wanted.
Yeah. Thank you for all of our panelists. Let us turn to the audience. Raise your hand. A microphone, the gentleman in the fourth row. Keep your hand up so the microphone finds you. Thank you, sir. Introduce yourself, quick comment or question.
Jason Pack, the Executive Director of the U.S.-Libya Business Association. Thanks for the great panel. Comment, critique, and then a quick question. I've been to a lot of these things about these Tunisian protests, particularly what's being said in the UK and Chatham House, Russi and stuff. And it sounds as if, hearing you, that, if the government was more revolutionary or didn't do so much austerity, that then the situation would be better. But that ignores the fundamental economics of it. And the analogy for me here is to the Greek protests, the Greek anti-austerity protests. Even when, of course, they got the most left-wing leader possible, there were still as many protests because there was no way to have economic growth in that situation. And Tunisia seems the same because of the tourism angle and the IMF conditionality. So really, could there be any changes that would be meaningful? And then my question is on the municipal elections.
The first one was a question, actually. Ended up being, well, that's good. Second question, go ahead.
I'm very concerned about these May 6th municipal elections in Tunis. Tell me if you think that that will galvanize protesters, what the security situation at polling stations in the country might be in your professional analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Take note of the questions. We'll take a few questions in a row and then come to the panel. Gentleman in the first row.
Thank you. Walid Nassar, partner at Lewis Bach. For those of us who are more familiar with the other two countries in the ME portion, being Libya and Egypt, and kind of seeing how the military factored into a lot of the discussion, I was wondering if you could kind of distinguish the situations in Tunisia and Morocco. I didn't hear the role of the military really factor in nearly as much into the discussion, and kind of what the role, if there is a role, and kind of how they factor into a lot of what we heard today.
Thank you, Walid. Let me see, gentleman in the fifth row, and then yes, you, sir. Well, go ahead.
I'm only the fifth row, if I can.
Well, I can't. My counting is off. Go ahead.
William Zarfin from SAIS. Algeria is the dark closet between Morocco and Tunisia. I wondered, on one hand, are there riots of this type in Algeria, and what is the effect of Tunisia and Morocco on what's going on in Algeria?
Thank you, sir. The gentleman right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Theo Wilson from Freedom House, and I actually wanted to ask the panel to speculate, if they would, on another North African country, which is Egypt, where less than 2 months out from the Egyptian presidential elections, and we're seeing the government steamrolling any opposition to Sisi. And does the panel think that the protests we've seen in Morocco and Tunisia have any chance of spreading to parts of Egypt?
Thank you. And there was a question here at the window on the left. Last question in this round.
Stanley Kober, MEI member. Is there a role for the United States to play?
Simple question. Shall we go from you first, Dokhi?
Okay.
Pick and choose whichever.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. I'll start with the last question because I think there is a role for the United States to play, and we're definitely in a very interesting time in the United States. So I think, but nonetheless, I mean, obviously the United States still has a lot of influence and leverage with these governments. So I think, let me just say on Tunisia, I think not just the United States, but I think Europeans have a very important role to play in that we are 7 years out, as was said by Bill, about the fact that we're 7 years out, and not only is the economic situation worsening, corruption is worsening, actually, and we're not consolidating the democracy in Tunisia, and that's a fact. And the question is, why is that happening, and what can we be doing? And I think donor governments like the United States and EU member states have been generous. They should continue to be generous. They should continue to give democracy and governance assistance to Tunisia. But I think we need to be very clear what we expect. I think certain institutions need to be strengthened. The Constitutional Court needs to be set up. This is not taking place right now. Right now, for example, the Parliament gets some measly amount of money. It's not even acting independently. The executive gets 4 times as much funding as the Tunisian Parliament as a whole. So Tunisian parliamentarians don't have offices. They don't have staff. They don't travel to the regions and to meet with their constituents. So it's a situation where if we want to continue, I think we should put some conditionalities, and we should be very clear about what we expect in that. So I think there's more we can do to be speaking out on that. The other question I wanted to address is the first one about the economic situation and austerity. I think the economic situation in Tunisia is so multi-factored. There's so many issues that need to be addressed, and the education system is one of the most important things. And I think it's going to take a great deal of time. And I think the international community and the IMF and others are going to have to be patient with the Tunisian government and with the Tunisian population. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But I think austerity alone, that's just my opinion. I'm an expert, but I just don't think austerity alone is going to be the way to do it.
Thank you, Dokhi. Intissar.
So I'm going to take 3 questions. The question on military role in Morocco. The military in Morocco is very much part of the sort of palace apparatus. It's completely controlled by the palace, so you can sort of think of it as an extension of that. We saw some mobilization in the north, but beyond that, there's not really been a big role in the protests. The military in Morocco doesn't really they're kept completely separate from politics. They don't really get involved in anything in that regard. The other point that I will make is Algeria protests. The question was, has there been any movement? I mean, for both Morocco and Algeria, as Bill had mentioned, there have always been sort of these low-level protests going on. And I think over the past year, there have been a couple of notable protest movements that have happened in Algeria. So similar to Morocco and other countries across the region, the government has sort of these 2 traditional tools, right? So you have crackdown and you have paying off a few groups. And the Algerian government still has a little bit of money to pay off some of the groups. The big question is, as oil prices are low, the government is essentially running out of money, how will they be able to kind of handle that aspect of it where you pay off these different groups that are protesting? And then the other point, just very broadly, that I will say on protests spreading to Egypt, the crackdown in Egypt has been so severe that I feel like there isn't really a lot of mobilization. The fear has gotten quite strong that people don't really go out and protest anymore. So I don't know. I doubt that it would carry through to Egypt.
Thank you. Bill?
I agree with everything that was said, and I'll try to keep my additions very, very brief. So if you want more than what I'm about to say, come up to me afterwards. And
well, let me note that the May 6 elections, nobody is touched on that. You can.
So first of all, I love Jason's question. It's spot on. But Tunisia is not Greece, and partially for the reasons Dokhi said. And Tunisian government has done many things wrong. They did this rollout completely wrong. They could have done sin taxes without a lot of these other things. They shouldn't be hiring people into useless jobs and blowing out the salaries of the, right? And then the sort of the speeches about sort of shut up, this will bring in investors when we don't even know if it's going to bring in investors. So I bet you could have had partial austerity in Tunisia and a realignment in a lot of this to save a lot of money, that a lot of things were done wrong. But then there's other things that you just can't do. I've been saying for a long time, if 50% of Tunisians work in the informal economy, start gently taxing the informal economy, for example. And what Joma did with the gray capital, bond issue in 2014 was brilliant. So there's a lot of things you can do with the Tunisian economy that solve the fiscal issues without making the population angry and addressing their underlying concerns. On the May 6th elections, let me just say that one of the reasons they've been delayed, and could even be delayed again, who knows, is that I'll just be honest, there's a fear Nehda is going to do too well, and there's a lot of fighting in rural areas between, let's say, a rising Nehda-associated new elites and the old elites that are back with the economic reconciliation law and this partial impunity, right? And so there's a kind of a duking out in rural areas that is going to get resolved sort of before, during, and after these elections. But there's a lot of problems in the remote areas, and then of course these protest waves. On the military, I think you have to say what regimes do, right, in times of protests matter, so militaries really matter. But then you have the issue of the mukhabarat states, right, how much of the crackdown is from police, how much from military, and then the issue of the economic role of the military. And if you sort of put it on a scale then, Egypt military up here, Algerian military here, Morocco military way down here, and Tunisian military almost in a negative way, almost non-existent, and except they played that critical role in 2011. So, and this is all deliberate. And you'd have to read like Michael Willis's chapter on militaries and his to get more on Algeria riots. Intissar answered the question. I'd just add that there's a lot of cross-pollination and similar issues, and all the protesters look at what's going on next door. For example, Algeria's had a lot of interesting environmental protests, so much so that the local Al-Qaeda affiliate, when they attacked one of the oil plants in Algeria a year and a half ago, said they were doing it because of fracking, so everybody's looking at each other's protests and trying to ingratiate themselves in very interesting ways. Freedom House, Egypt. I was doing my fieldwork on the Moroccan protests. I remember asking a February 20th supporter why they stopped protesting. It was the guy who was working on the plumbing in my house, and he said, "Shabana al-Asal." We got tired of the stick. And this goes directly to what Intissar was saying, that to some degree protesters are rational actors, and when they think their protesters won't get them anything, which gets to the feedback loop I said earlier, they'll stop protesting. That doesn't mean there isn't anger there. That doesn't mean that most Algerian youth wouldn't love to have another revolution. It's simply that they don't see any value in protesting at this juncture. And then just in terms of the role of the U.S., I will add to what the others said that the U.S., and this was part of my speech, the U.S. can do a lot more in promoting democracy, helping the Tunisian parliament, working on governance issues, training up, using Millennium Challenge account, which was very badly used in Morocco at the beginning, much better. Existing funds can be reprogrammed, and this is why I was telling you about those meetings in the bowels of the, I think it's the building, the Senate building, where the Appropriations Committee is. But getting back to another one of my co-panelists' points, they're sort of symbolic and pressure type things the U.S. can do, and then there's actually programming things that you can do. And one of the most successful things I've seen as a former government bureaucrat is the more you tie your conditionality to what you're fixing, the better. So you say, okay, you've got a problem of corruption in this sector. All right, we're going to give you X millions of dollars to combat corruption if you help us along by taking one or two initial actions. And if you do sort of very, very targeted conditionality like that, you can move balls forward much more quickly than the Tunisian parliament in this case would otherwise, or the Moroccan ruling elite would otherwise be willing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, but let's go to another round of questions. A gentleman in that row.
Hi there. Hi there, David Ernier. I would just like to ask the panel if you guys could speak to the level of sophistication that security apparati have in monitoring and engaging with organizational aspects with electronic communication, so social media.
Thank you. Any other questions? A gentleman in the very back.
Hello, my name is Adnan. I'm from Tunisia. My question is about what do you think, for the panels, what do you think the security forces, police and military have, if they develop this fear of the winter, basically? Because if you can see in the history, December and January are very movemental times. And if they develop some kind of new approaches to dealing with this violence or riots, and what will be the future of that? Are we seeing a new innovation in policing, like the Miami approach, or is it just responding to new things?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? In the very front here.
Hello, my name is Charles Bertos. I'm a student at George Washington. This is specifically for Mr. Lawrence. You made it a point during your opening statement to say that we did have an Arab Spring, because some scholars are determining that now.
Including my colleagues at George Washington.
Which I've taken some of those classes. But would you agree that we're now in an Arab winter? Because a lot of other professors at GW have mentioned that, but a lot of readings have said that that is a false term to use. So I wanted your opinion on that.
It's a seasonal question.
Well, we had another seasonal question back there, too.
I know. Well, let's take those. Let's go in the other order. Bill first.
I'm a man for all seasons. And I really don't believe in the winter hypothesis. I think it's ridiculous. And it was mostly about an Islamist winter, which wasn't even really the case. And certainly the ruling Nahda party and the ruling PJD in Morocco belied a lot of our assumptions about what so-called Islamist parties do in power. So the Islamist winter hypothesis is ridiculous. I'm happy to say more afterwards if you want. But in terms of the Arab Spring, I think we just have to redefine what springs are. Again, these weren't. We even had a spring in half of Libya on the Arab Spring model, So, and another one in Tripoli. So, 5 months later or 6 months later. So a spring isn't a success. A spring isn't a change of everything. A spring is a spring, right? A blossoming, like the Prague Spring, which failed, like many others. And it was coined by the person who later denied it at GW, right? It was the right term, and it's the reason why most North Africans still call it Arab Springs, because it was the right term. And just one more point. One of the huge success stories of U.S. assistance through IMET and through civilian police training is the change in police tactics. And so when I see statistics like in Algeria during one of the big protest waves where you had, I think it was 400 police injuries and no police deaths, which never happens when you have a poorly trained police force. We had another one in Morocco like that, where we had, I think, 40 police injuries in the north and no protest or major injuries or death. That's a restrained police force that's trained and using its, and I can say more about that afterwards, on electronic surveillance. It's not as good as they'd like it to be. I think the major strength, there is quite a bit. It's quite good, but I think the major successes of the Moroccan mukhabarat in particular is human intelligence. And when the Moroccans go to the Germans and say, that Tunisian guy that just went from Turkey to Germany, we know all about him. That wasn't electronic surveillance. That's Moroccan mukhabarat working in Europe and getting their information. There's a good side to mukhabarat, right, and a bad side to mukhabarat. Can I just one quick more point? I think in my analysis of Morocco, I talk sometimes about good makhzen, bad makhzen, right? So good makhzen is using a lot of modern techniques and it likes light touches on civil protests and developmental solutions to problems. But old makhzen's still there in Morocco, and they'll take names after protests and beat people up and plant drugs in their pockets and arrest them for drug trafficking or whatever. Old makhzen's still there. There's a kind of a struggle between old makhzen and new makhzen in Morocco, and that continues.
Thank you,
I don't
Bill.
know if you agree with
Intissar?
any of that,
I would just add, there on the question of spring, I don't really have anything to say except I want to share a very funny tweet that I saw. It was something like, my biggest disappointment with the Arab Spring is that I've come to call it the Arab Spring. And I think that very much, I don't know, that very much reflects how I feel. In terms of the question of sophistication, police sophistication, I think they're getting better, particularly in Morocco. They're really getting better about the use of social media, Twitter, Facebook a lot, Twitter as well. But I would very much agree with what you said on human sort of the human element, really, the spies or whatever you want to call them. I think that's really all I had on the last round of questions.
Okay, Dokhi?
I actually wanted to make a point about the May 6th elections based on what you said, Bill, which is interesting that your analysis is that, you know, the fear is that Nahda is gonna take over, and I think that's exactly right. I think there's been that fear, and so Nahda Tunis has been trying to keep pushing that back, and they've been successful. But what's curious to me is that they agreed on an electoral law to push out and crowd out smaller parties. So there are provisions of this new electoral law that now basically makes it very difficult for smaller parties to win. So I guess what you said is right. They're going to just break it up themselves, between themselves, and which is definitely not, I think,
calling it the
democratic way to go.
The Tunisian duopoly.
Exactly. The one thing I wanted to say about social media is I'm always just shocked and concerned about how much Tunisians use Facebook for everything, for almost everything. So every Tunisian civil society organizations that I know, their website is their Facebook. I mean, they just do so much on Facebook. And I think there's a for me, there's a fear there that, and I hope this never happens, but we're not consolidated, right? So if the Tunisian government at one point wants to shut down Facebook, or that's it. I mean, that's literally shutting down civil society. I mean, really, websites, communications, everything is happening primarily on Facebook, and I always raise this when I go there, but it's a threat, I think. I mean, they need to be careful and diversify, maybe. So.
Thank you, Dokhi. Let me end with one question to all of you. Sort of the general question, in some Arab countries, it's easy to answer, are they going in the wrong direction or right direction? Tunisia and Morocco are both interesting cases because, you know, there's maybe progress, regression, it's a complicated case. So my question, sort of in telegraphic form to each of you, do you see things in the near future going in the right direction or wrong direction, and what should we be looking for in the coming year as indicators? And I'll start with you, Dokhi.
I think the people of the region are going in the right direction. I think their governments are just trying to push them back. And I think in general, I'm optimistic because I do see a more engaged population across the Middle East, across the various countries of the Middle East. And I think we just need to continue to look to see how the governments respond. And I think there is, I mean, whether it's a little less this year, a little bit more this year, I do think that the governments of the region understand that they need to be more responsive. And I think we have to look and see the pace of reforms that they've promised. I mean, it's slow. It's painfully slow. But I think the expectations of these populations are going up, and I don't think they're going to be brought backward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dokhi. Intissar.
I would echo what you said. I think there are reasons to be optimistic as there are reasons to be concerned. In Morocco, same thing, a very engaged population, sort of an aware population. But, you know, obviously the regression on some of the political openings that we have immediately after 2011 is a little bit concerning. And really the big question is, will there be an outlet for these protesters' demands? Will these protests spread? Will they get to sort of a point where people just feel completely that they're not being listened to and there is no way forward?
Mm-hmm. Bill?
Tunisia is doing a lot of things well and regressing in other areas. So I come down to right, but too slow. Morocco is doing a lot of things well and doing a lot of other things badly, and they're going too slow. Mm-hmm. So relative to themselves, I would say right, but too slow. Morocco has a very interesting slogan they've been advancing last year through the foreign minister, and he used it here in Washington in the private meeting, and then he's been using it public elsewhere, of stability through reform, mm-hmm. You know, which is a nice slogan. And relative to Algeria, and Morocco is doing much better than Algeria, so that's one of the reasons they can say we're doing really well, because they kind of look one country over. But they are, both countries are embracing reform. It's just they're not embracing it in a way that delivers for the populations. So we'll continue to see massive micro-protests, and it's very hard to protect when local micro-protests spikes into regional and then spikes into national, and it will happen in both countries. We just don't know when and what will provoke it.
Thank you, Bill. This has been a very fascinating panel, really, on two complex countries and cases. Thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panel.